Povedal bom nekaj, kar verjetno večina v tej dvorani še ne ve. Skratka, ta knjiga je pred 4 leti in pol izšla pri ameriški založbi Senja tekste. Doživela je 15 prevodov v najrazličnejše jezike tega sveta do zdaj. In vsi prevodi so bili narejeni po angleški izdaji te knjige. Jaz sem seveda to knjigo dobila v roke v angleščini, ko sem se prikopala do kontakta direktnega z nosilcem pravic te knjige, sem ga prosila, sem rekla, zakaj bi delali mi prevod prevoda, če lahko prevedemo to knjigo iz italijanščine. In ko je avtor poslal italijansko verzijo te knjige, sem ugotovila, da manjkajo nekatera poglavja in da so druga poglavja krajšena, zgoščena. Skratka, črtana pa so predvsem tista poglavja, ki govorijo o premisleku italijanskega operaizma, postoperaizma. In rekla sem, mi tega ne bomo črtali, ne bomo delali prevoda, delali bomo prevod iz jezika, v katerem je ta knjiga nastala. In zato je pač pravzaprav to edina izdaja na tem svetu. Skratka, knjiga v italijanščini ni šla, avtor že 5-6 let ne več ne objavlja v Italiji. Skratka, knjiga je kar se da blizu izvirniku. Poleg tega pa je avtor za to slovensko izdajo napisal poseben predgovor, samo za to izdajo, za kar se mu res tako zahvaljujem in sem se mu že zahvalila. Skratka, tako da veste, ta izdaja je enkratna in edina na vsem svetu, čeprav je šla že v Koreji, ki je vse verjetno morda povedal. Skratka, gre za zadnjega v nizu dogodkov, ki smo ga pripravili v teh 3 dneh, res intenzivnih 3 dneh druženja s Francom Berardijem in Bifom in že planiramo nove dogodke. Ampak tem več naslednje leto, upam, da se uresničijo. Hvala, uživajte in predajam zdaj besedo moderatorju Pavlišiču.
Lepo zdrav, v mojem imenu. Moje ime je Andrej, jaz smo delili to okroglo mizo. Uradni jezik bo angleščina, so I switch now to English and I hope that it will serve our purpose well. Thanks to Civil and Amelia for their introductions, and I will also again introduce Franco Berardi Bifo and Nikolai is here today to discuss the book. So Franco, as we all know, is a theorist, a media activist, among other things. For decades he has been a regular contributor to all kinds of debates on the ways of contemporary capitalism and on the possibilities of humanity's separation from it. His personal biography includes being part of the movement of autonomia in Italy in the 70s. He was among the founders of the first pirate radio station in Italy, famous Radio Alice, and analyzing, articulating, and organizing social transformation in real time. That time brought a lot of curious police attention also, and that eventually led him, as so many other Italian comrades of the period, to seek exile in France. Once there, he established a long and productive relationship with Felix Gattari, and then, as the highly networked world of today was slowly beginning to take shape in the early 90s, he focused his research more on internet, on things cyber, and the curious life of the network itself. So he has published numerous books on new economy, movement of the cognitariat, media activism, relation to communication power, new pathologies of semi-capitalism, and a lot more. We are honored to have you as a guest today to discuss the book of yours. My second guest, and our second guest today, is Nikolai, a writer, a filmmaker, currently employed at Fakulteta za humanistične študije at Univerzita Primorska. He is also a member of editorial board of časopisa Hitro znanosti, an academic journal. primary research interests are sociology of literature and post-colonial studies, but also he has a rich activist biography, starting from the Alternativa Furliana in late 80s, all the way through destruction of Yugoslavia, occupation of Metelko, Autonomous Cultural Center, and then all the way through no global struggles at the turn of the millennium until today. So I'm also honored to have Nikolai discussing the book together with Franco. So Franco has been in Ljubljana for a couple of days already, and he has spoken quite a lot about many different topics today. The idea is to focus more on the book itself. As Amelia already explained, is a unique achievement on the global scale. So definitely it deserves all our attention. So we speak about the book DUŠA DELO, and the idea is that Franco and Nikolai will guide us through the main ideas of the book, and as well the idea is that this is a discussion of all. So if at any point, starting from the beginning, any of you, members of the audience, have the desire or wants to say something, wants to ask something, wants to comment, please raise your hand and the word will be given to you. I think the formalities are concluded, so let's start at the beginning. Franco, the title of the book is Sodobni. So it's not the concept of soul is not widely recognized as useful concepts for the demands of class struggle. You acknowledge this yourself in the very opening passages of the book, and you warn the reader that the soul that you're speaking about is definitely, it doesn't have a lot to do with the soul of the priest. But still the question remains, what do you mean by soul? Why isn't it is at work, and what does it have to do with our lives?
Well, the word soul is hardly a concept. At least I don't use that word as a serious concept, but as a sort of metaphorical and ironic way to talk about many things that are happening in the social sphere nowadays. Nothing to do with the spiritual dimension. Rather, I think to James Hill, who speaks of soul in many points of his work, in a sense which is, the psyche of the Greeks, but actually the metaphor of soul is a way to speak of many different things with the same word. Many things. Yes. First of all, our cognitive activity. This is a level of the soul. But also what Spinoza calls the affect, which means the ability to be affected, the ability of being able to change according to the changing environment of the bodies that are surrounding me. And at the very end, the ability to feel pleasure and to feel suffering, which is very important in the definition of the political problem of exploitation and of autonomy in the age of financial capitalism and of quality work.
Can I, one of these now. Can I just say something about the soul, or maybe Frank is also, well, he's the author of a number of books, but one of his latest is called The Uprising of Poetry and Finance. And in a section of that book, Franco talks about the need to invent a new language. And that new language is poetry, because poetry is, you can't exchange it. It has no exchange value, no direct equivalence. And I think we should take that concept seriously. And the thing that I found interesting about the soul, I know in the soul at work you say, basically, I don't want to use the word with all its metaphysical, historical, religious baggage, etc., etc. But if we take the soul as a metaphor, if we think of it poetically, then it becomes quite useful, I think. And just give you some examples. The soul is a good way of thinking our present conditions. Why? The soul lives in an eternal present. The soul has no past, no future. As historical beings, we find ourselves in the same moment in time. Historical consciousness is being erased very, very quickly. Capitalism, as you know, tries to give us this impression that we live in a continual present. With regards to the future, we don't have a future. Thinkers of the right, like Fukuyama, you remember his hypothesis, history is over. There will be no qualitative change. Society has reached its developmental form in liberal democracy. No other development is possible. You have thinkers of the left, like Franco here, also talking about this idea that there is no future. So, in a way, we live also this condition of the soul, right? We live in this eternal present. Now, we live it also for two other reasons. Now, if you take the classical conception of the soul, of course, you need some kind of metaphysical transcendence, which is a fancy way of talking about God, okay? You need something, a signifier who delimits the soul. And we are living in conditions, of course we live in a very secular age, but at the same time we have something rising above us, don't we? We have something delimiting our ethical relations. And what is that? That's the internet. That's the internet. That is where everything is being stored today. Where everything is being stored, and at one point, Judgment Day will come along, and each individual shall be judged according to his or her actions. And I mention the internet because, as you know, we live in the age of Edward Snowden's revelations about the extent of surveillance. And of course, people have been very critical about the degree of surveillance going on through the internet. There is no privacy on the internet. What I find very interesting is that one commentary that was lacking was that basically, if you have surveillance, that is one thing. You can escape from surveillance. The problem is, once you know that surveillance exists, you start living in conditions of self-censorship. And so I think in this post-Snowden era, in this era of mass internet surveillance, we will start acting as though we have this giant power over us that controls, follows everything we do. And we will start acting in ways that will be deeply conservative. And again, you can draw the parallel with religious thought. You can see how, for instance, a very religious Catholic would also be controlling him or herself. Of course, I speak this as a Protestant, or somebody who was brought up as a Protestant, but you can see the parallel there. And another thing, why the soul is very, very good. In this age of cognitive labour, of the cognitarian, I think we tend to forget one thing. Now, most of us, if I'm honest, when I was 16, I went to work in a factory for 2 weeks. And this is what I did. Okay? And at that point, I decided I was going to become an intellectual. And I think it's terrible. I don't understand. A lot of things aren't clear to me. I don't know why manual labour is paid less, valued less than intellectual labour. That is something that I find very bizarre. I don't know how money works. That's also, I've never really understood money. Things like that. But the thing about, I was talking to a student of mine whose parents are working class. His mother is a cleaner. His father is a bricklayer. And I was complaining how much work I have to do. I have to do 10, 12 hours. And the difference between cognitive and manual labour is that nobody expects a manual labourer to work for 10, 12 hours for 7 days a week, or even more. For cognitive labourers, for the cognitariat, that is somehow expected. And where does the soul come in again? Why I think Berardi's use of this concept is so useful, so potent, so poetically potent and powerful, is the soul does not abide by the limitations of the physical world. And the cognitariat lives in that condition where it is given work as though it itself does not abide, there has no limitations in the physical world. So you can just work for 8 hours, for 10 hours, for 16 hours, for 20 hours, etc., etc.
So the main process that also you're investigating is the transformation of work itself under present mode of capitalism that you call semi-capitalism. So, and Nikolai already somehow introduced this topic. So maybe can you, in a way, just outline again where do you see these changes really significantly influence the subjectivity of the workforce of the let's say of the human being body that is working, so and thus somehow making the possibilities of political organization that were historically present obsolete. Also, you are writing in the book that the politics of yesteryear is no more, and that there are new questions that, let's say, cognitariat needs to face if it wants to produce some kind of autonomy. And could you elaborate on that?
First, let me say something about the concept of senior capitalism. There is a terminological problem which is relevant. Some use the word cognitive capitalism. For instance, Jan Moulier, many others. I don't like the expression cognitive capitalism because actually capitalism is totally ignorant. He knows nothing. We are cognitive. Cognitive is the work, not the concretion of cognitive work. The accumulation, the transformation of cognitive activity into capital is the transformation of knowledge into something that is it's not knowledge, it's the contrary of knowledge by any point of view. So how can we define the prevailing form of capitalism? Also the expression immaterial capitalism or immaterial labor is not I don't like that definition, because labor always is material, also when it is absolutely cognitive. Anyway, labor implies the investment of physical, erotic energy of the bodies there when you are knowing, inventing, or looking for information and so on. So my idea is that the defining difference is the transformation of the cycle of production in the sphere of work and in the sphere of capitalist accumulation in terms of signal, of science, of information, if you want. Infocapital is another way to say the same thing. The essential change is there. Then I know very well that today the industrial workers are much more than they were 30 years ago. I mean, we are not talking of the disappearing, of the dissolution of industrial work. By a quantitative point of view, industrial work is enormously increased in the last 30 years. The problem is that the difference in the organization of physical industrial work itself is in the sphere of informatization. I mean, how is it possible that industrial work can be totally deterritorialized, displaced, delocalized, fragmented, recombined? This is also the explanation of the process of precarization and the process of disempowerment, of political disempowerment of the industrial work. Many friends tell me, oh, you are talking of cognitive labor, but the workers in China or in Brazil are more numerous than they were in Torino 40 years ago. That's true. The problem is that the 100,000 workers in Torino were politically powerful because they were totally territorialized and capital needed their territorialization. Nowadays, if the workers of Shenzhen decide to revolt, to ask for an augmentation of their salary that the Chinese capitalist does not like, it's easy. Overnight, the factory is no more in Shenzhen, but in Vietnam, just to name a place. But where is the source of this new force of capital? Where is the source of this disempowerment of industrial labor in the informatization or semiotization of the cycle of production? So, when at the same time, this is a way also to understand what precarity is, what precarity means. Essentially, precarity is not only a juridical form of relation between the worker and the capitalists, but also the evidence, the experience that labor is deterritorialized, the permanent deterritorialization of work. This is the real foundation of precarization.
Well, maybe just as a comment, I think that the notion of precarity is very useful. Again, it's very potent. but I think it's quite important, I think, to keep in mind, because these debates happen in Slovenia, and it's sometimes what happens in these debates is that one dimension is lost, and that is, I think we have to keep in mind that precarious labour is the original condition of labour in all class-based societies. Labour is arbitrary. That's one thing. The precariat is not something new. Precarious labour, conditions of precarity are the original conditions of capitalism. Historically, we have had a precariat for a much longer period than we have had,
Yes.
let's say, the industrial working class, as we would recognise it in the Fordist regime. The other thing to keep in mind, and this is important because we want to avoid Eurocentrism, and that is that when we look at conditions of precarity and where is the precariat located in the majority, where have precarious conditions of labour existed for the longest time? It's in the global south. France famines, wretched of the earth, landless peasants, the urban proletariat. That is the precariat, right? It's important to keep this in mind. Why? Because, of course, capitalism has different forms, and semi-capitalism is just one of them. But we also live in a world in which 50% of the population is still rural, in which 40% of the population is networked. So we have roughly 50% of the population outside these urban industrial precarious models, and we have 60% of the population outside these networked regimes of labour. And what that means is that we have the coexistence of different forms of capitalism. Now, I do agree with Franco when he says that semi-capitalism is a pervasive form. But what these different coexisting forms mean is that probably in the future we will have to rethink our strategies of emancipation. They will have to be much more plural than they were in the past and take these different realities into consideration. So I think when we think about the precariat, when we think about conditions of capitalism, we really do have to have a global view.
Okay, I would come back to this question of emancipation later. Now I would like to maybe that we speak about depression and pathologies that you also write extensively in the book that we are discussing today. So the theme that you're developing is that technological advance is increasingly producing a world of chaos and disorientation from the standpoint of human being. So endless flow of information, cacophony of impulses, internet, etc., probably few of us can even somehow track everything that's going on day-to-day level. So, and all of these, all the impulses and the speed of the whole development means that we as humans, with our limited mental capabilities, are unable, we are no longer able to process all the information in a way that we used to. So incapability of cognitive workers to orient ourselves adequately in the new landscape defined by semi-capitalism produces new subjectivities, produces new pathologies, produces generalized depression, panic. So depression and panic somehow becomes an essential characteristic of soul at work.
Alain Ehrenberg, French psychoanalyst, in a book titled La fatigue d'être soi, the fatigue of being oneself, explains that contemporary depression is essentially the effect of a social blackmail. I would say also of the creation of a social double bind in the precise Václavic or Bergson meaning. Bergson describes the double bind as an injunction which is contradictory. Be spontaneous. How can I be spontaneous if you order me to be spontaneous? And actually the question in the contemporary condition of generalized competition is a systemic effect. Either you win in competition or you lose. If you win, that means that all of your life has been dedicated to something which is not your life, but the accumulation of economic power and so on and so on. Or you lose and you are socially culpabilized for being a loser. Whether the game is a lose-lose game since the beginning, and the people don't know, but feel this. The effect is depression, because you think that winning in the competition is the only possible game. So you are losing exactly the only possible game which exists nowadays. This is about depression, but also I'd like to say something more about this subject, because the problem is solved. So how can I come out from this condition? Felix Guattari said that the problem of depression is not a therapy of normalization, of reconduction of the psychic life of the individual to a good norm. The problem is, he says, refocalization. And refocalization essentially means changing the social context, the environment of your expectations and of your performance. It's not easy, of course. Now I see that on another side of the psychoanalytic theory, some psychoanalysts, for instance, in Italian, called Massimo Riccardi, who is a very interesting thinker, very interesting, but wrong. It happens sometimes to become people. Is trying to explain the present depression in terms of courage, of hyper-expression. I totally agree with you. I totally agree with this theoretical when he says the liberation, let's say, of desire as unchained the psychic energies in such a way that we are unable to deal with the reality of limit. So, and up to this point, I follow him. But then he tries to find a way out, and he says the problem is the reaffirmation of the role of the father. Essentially, we have lost the father. The only way out from this depressive situation is the reconstitution of the Lacanian name of the father. I don't know, there is something true in that, but I don't think that the reconstitution of the father is the way, also because it's a utopian way. I mean, how can you reconstitute the force of law in a reality which is totally deregulated? And I think that the problem is not the father, the problem is the mother. Actually, it's there you find the real source of the problem. The problem is the disappearance of the linguistic body of the mind. The problem is that the present generation is a generation that is learning more words from a machine than from the body of the mother. And when I say the mother, I am not talking of a woman biologically, I am talking of the body. The mother can be a father, but not the father of the law, the father of the body, the father of the affective relation that gives me the possibility of understanding that this is aqua. And this is aqua because my mother told me so, not because the signifier is linked to the signifier. So the access to reality has become frail. And the question is essentially an effect of this precarization of language, of our relation with language.
Nikolai, before you already touched on this topic of no future, also Franco is writing excessively on. You've been also in your writing dealing constantly with the revolutionary project in all its promises, aspirations, failures, and you often say that, of course, future is part and parcel of any revolutionary project. So, what are then the implications for the project if we suddenly are left without a future?
Well, let me just say something about depression. So I cheerfully recognize myself in Franco's writing about depression, and yes, depression is one of the conditions. Really trace it to the effect of capitalism, and also the degree to which you cannot reintegrate once you are depressed. I mean, you find it very, very hard to economically and socially reproduce yourself. However, the way that Franco writes about depression, that's one territory. The way depression is increasing in our society, the way in which, for those of you who haven't read the Sodelujejo work, Franco writes a lot about how large sectors of contemporary society need various forms of drugs in order to survive, day in, day out. Prozac, for instance, we talk about the Prozac economy. So those kind of medical interventions are becoming integral to our society. Now, I should say that Franco also writes about suicide. And he sees suicide as the way out, the ultimate refusal. And there's a lot of truth in that. It's only through suicide. I think it was Albert Camus who said that suicide is the only real philosophical problem. And through suicide, it's the only way an individual can reclaim his or her subjectivity, become the full subject of their own life. Now, I understood that quite literally. It's a very thing to read, but I'll connect suicide to what you asked me, Andrej. And I think that, of course, suicide can be a way of rejection, but there's also a life beyond suicide. And that is in the sense that once you contemplate the fact that you can terminate your own life, and you take into consideration that you're going to die anyway. I mean, sorry folks, that's just the way it is. The human condition exists that way. Then a whole new sea of possibilities opens up. You can take chances, etc., etc. And on the individual, as it is on the individual level, it's very the same. It's the same on the social level as well. I should apologise. I'm getting my teeth reconstructed, so I have a slight lisp. So, yes, Franco does write about the fact that we do not have a future. There are many different elements. Franco can enumerate them a lot better than I can, of course. But we don't have a future because what? The computer is taking over. Humanity is no longer the subject of its own history. The resources of the planet are finite. We don't have great utopian projects anymore on the horizon, etc., etc. But once we take that into consideration, once we say, it's over, basta, game over, nothing left, once we reach that point when there is nothing to live for because the future doesn't exist, a whole new sea of possibilities opens up because we literally have nothing to lose. Nothing to lose. It can't get any worse. I mean, I know John Cage says, don't try, and he was an anarchist like me, and he said, don't try to change the world because you only make things worse. Well, no, that really is not true. Things can only get better. So once we face that finality of ourselves as individuals, the finality of the world as it is, then we can start taking chances. And this is the spirit in which, again, I read Franco's views on suicide, but also his views on the lack of a future and the possibility for meaningful change.
Let me say something about the no future which is not my invention, of a group of young people in London 35 years ago, when Thatcher was taking power inside the Tories and was starting her triumphal march towards the transformation of the world and the declaration that there is no such thing as society. So no future is the other side of the same coin. You said that there is no such thing as society, but I answer that there is no future. It's also, in this sense, is a constatation, a description of, but it's also a sort of strategical a strategical sentence that says no future. You know, when you precarization and precarious exploitation is essentially based on the idea that I don't give you a salary. You are an intern, internship is not a salary, but I give you credit. So tomorrow maybe that you will find a salary, and tomorrow you will find someone who will tell you, I don't give you a salary, but I promise. When the precarity is based on the rationale of the infinite promise of a better salary or a salary at all, and the promise of growth. In exchange of this promise, you give me your life. And one day, who knows? So please, stop talking about the future. Let's talk about now. That is, by the point of view of the social struggle, it's in my opinion, a good way to change the landscape. And then comes suicide. Actually, I do not prescribe suicide. As I am a militant, I should be the example in that case. And it's not my intention to do that. I simply try to describe the phenomenology of the current reality. And the current reality is, first of all, in the last 30 years, according to the figures of the World Health Organization, suicide has increased of, listen to me, 60%, right? 60% in the last 30 years, which are the years of the neoliberal triumph, and also the years of connectivity and so on. So I'm looking for a relation between neoliberal competition, suicide, and virtualization of daily life and suicide. At the end, this is the phenomenology of financial capitalism. If you look at the effects of the so-called financial crisis on the environmental politics of the powers of the world, look at the Copenhagen summit, look at the Warsaw summit, what is the effect? Forget about the future of the planet. The planet is committing suicide because we have to think to the rescue of the banks.
Can I just say, this is connected to what Andrej said and what you just said. I mean, an author that you referred to a lot and who's been very important, Jean Baudrillard, once said that the problem with ideologies and practices of emancipation, he was thinking of Marxism specifically, is that they have this ideology of deferral. So what this means is basically, comrades, we have to work a little bit harder now in order to be free later on. We have to be more disciplined now in order to be free. Yeah, later on. So you're constantly deferring this lived experience of emancipation, this real existing, I know this is an oxymoron, but real existing utopian. When you think about it, I mean, some of us here today, I'm sure we've had activist experiences where activism has, instead of friendship, it's become hierarchy and discipline and a lot of political work in the most disgusting of senses, and by which you escape to the real world, because you can have fun, you can relax in the real world, you can be yourself. And just to round up my thoughts, I think this idea that there is no future is very, very important, just for the reasons that Franco said. Because if you stop thinking about what the future will bring, will we have a classless society? Will we have communism? Will we have this? Will we have this in 20, 50, 100, 200 years, etc., etc.? That is all deferral. If you think of a society of individuals in which there is no future, where do you live? You live in the here and now. You start taking chances. You live through this sea of possibilities.
Let's speak about politics now in the way that you also write about it. Like on 3, let's say you start like in the forward, in addition, right? Politics has no more strategic role. What remains is corruption, violence, and crime. And then at the very end of the book, you also somehow you say that political speech has to give way to therapeutic speech. So you speak about changing politics for therapy. And this sounds quite defeatist for those of us that somehow we're always trying to navigate the Northwestern Passage to the revolutionary society or to the classless society. So, but from all the discussion, everything else, it's clear that it's not the defeatist position that you are taking. So I would like you to elaborate more about this shift from politics to therapy, and what does that mean on the level of social conditions?
First of all, we should better define the concept of politics. That is an overused word that means everything. So by many points of view, I cannot. The Aristotelian definition of politics, the human being, a political zone is too large for me. I prefer to think of politics in the sense of Machiavelli or in the sense of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Both think of politics as the art and the technique of decision. And what is decision? Decision is the ability to cut one possibility among many, not infinite, but many. The problem of the presupposition of political decision is the ability to master information, to the ability to know enough, not to know everything, but to know the relevant alternatives. So this is possible in a social situation, in a technological situation, in which the relevant information is rare, scarce, relatively controlled, in a sense. We are out from that situation. The essential change to the level of information and politics nowadays is the infinite proliferation of the sources of information, the infinite proliferation of the flows of stimulation, info stimulation. So we have become unable, and when I say we in this case, I say the political brain has become totally unable to control the infinite complexity of the world. I often refer to a discussion between Jürgen Habermas and Niklas Luhmann in 1972. They met in a public conference for a discussion on the problem of the future of information and democracy. And the good rationalist Jürgen Habermas said, more information, more democracy, of course. You know more, you have the possibility of understanding and elaborating more. And the malicious Niklas Luhmann answered that I am not sure of that. Probably when information becomes too thick, too present in our landscape, at that point we become unable to understand, to elaborate, and to decide about the relevant. Actually what has happened after that, in my opinion, is exactly what Luhmann has predicted. We see that if you listen to the discourse of the politicians of the European Union, for instance, they don't say government, they say governance. And the linguistic shift is very important. Government is the intellectual ability to decide, rationally decide. Machiavelli says that the prince is the male who is able to reign on the fortune, the female, the chaotic female, the infinite chaos of nature, and the powerful masculine decision of the political power. Well, it's over. The masculine power is over because the feminine richness of the chaotic reality has escaped to our ability of control. So what happens? If you want to create power, if you do not accept chaos as a good thing, and politicians are unable to understand this problem, you need governance, and governance is the replacement of decision with automatisms. So the relevant decisions are in a sense automated and incorporated, embedded in the deciding machine. What happens in the field of financial
automated?
It is all about that. The automation of the decision that finance is the defining force of present politics, so the politician is only a sort of employee of the financial automatism. Then we saw what is the job of the politician, to take some part of the money to his pocket. The corruption is no more the bad side of political action, is the alpha and omega of the political action, as the political action is nothing Of course, I am not talking of politics this way. I am not talking of politics as conscious action of transformation of our life. That is a totally different subject. I don't call it politics because I don't like terminological confusion. I call it therapy. Pardon me. You see, I call it therapy. And I know it's an ambiguous word, but it's my beginning. I am looking for the word to find it, and I will not find the word if we don't find the thing, the new form of conscious ability to change our daily life.
I think we are missing interventions from the audience, and right now we really...
I have a question. I would like to ask something in regards to the therapy we were just talking about. If I understand correctly, we imagine therapy as some sort of aesthetic practice, right?
Sorry, can you just give you the microphone?
I give you the microphone, because I need to there.
So my question is in regards to the therapy we were just talking about. If I understand correctly, you imagine therapy as some sort of aesthetic practice, an artistic practice, and the aim of this practice, according to you, should be redirecting the flows of desire away from well-described property or away from competition and other interests that are determined by the capital, right? So, I mean, basically, I was hoping that you could elaborate a bit on how do you imagine this artistic practice as therapy to proceed, and where do you imagine these practices to happen? I would be grateful if you could explain this a bit. Thank you.
Yes, actually, when you use the word aesthetic, you are touching the point, the real point. Etymological aesthetic is something not so much with art, but very much with perception. And the problem is the social aesthesis, social perception. Our perception is disturbed by the acceleration of the infosphere, by the generalization of competition, and so on. So, the crucial problem is a problem of tuning, of resynchronizing the social perception with the surrounding, with the environment as info-environment and so on. So think of the movement of Occupy, that I consider a political failure, but an extraordinary invention at the level of a possible therapy. Why those people have decided to occupy the squares of Spain for a month, 6 million people staying day and night there. Why the practice of occupation of the public space? By the political point of view, it's a little bit inefficient. It's producing nothing, because in the square there is not the power. You can occupy the square, the street. You can also occupy the bank, and it's nothing, because the real power is not there. It's in the cyberspace, it's in the virtual relation between computers. So, occupying is not an efficient, an effective, not efficient, an effective political action, but it's a poetical act of reactivation of the social body. The body comes out from the room, from the computer space, from the cognitive repetition of the virtual act of connection, and in the place of connection you have an attempt to conjunction to recreate the possibility of a bodily conjunction of the erotic body of society. This is therapy. I know that Occupy is over in a sense because at the very end we have become aware of the fact that the stakes were too high and the process of reactivation of the body was unable to become a political process of change. So the change is the general Sisi or the horrible Morsi or the Nazist Yushchenko and so on and so on. So Occupy has opened the possibility but has been unable to critically transform that possibility. But it's the beginning of a process. It's the beginning of a process of displacement of the energy of society from the level of political confrontation to the level of autonomy. And what autonomy is the ability to leave them alone. Do you want to make war? Do you want to be corrupt? Do you want to decide and to steal and to accumulate? It's your business. We are going elsewhere. Our bodies are going elsewhere. The problem is finding the elsewhere. It's a real, poetical problem. In this sense, yes, it's what I mean. The therapy is a political act.
Any other questions or comments? If not,
I think that the therapy is a political act, yes, because I think that the problem that we face today is the face of our problem. Now, what I mean by that is when you switch on the media and listen to politicians, they talk about markets, they talk about interest rates, they talk about this. These are all abstractions that abstract the fact that what people are losing their jobs, are being thrown out of their homes, that individuals are suffering in various forms. And yet we do the same thing. We also abstract. We denounce capitalism, don't we? We denounce capitalism as some kind of abstraction, and yet it is people that make capitalism. Now I know things have changed, and I think this is the one of the great contributions of the Occupy movement is being to locate, personalize the nature of our problem. Who oppresses us? It's the 1%. We are the 99%. And that is important. Why? Because our own social relations, they determine the kind of society we live in. And what we have to do, therefore, is to reconfigure our own social relations, our own personal relations. And this is why, for instance, Occupy, I'm not as skeptical as you are. I think Occupy it comes within a trajectory of movements and forms of opposition to go from Occupy to various demonstrations, back to the anti-war demonstrations in 2003, demonstrations in Seattle in 99, the Zapatista uprising in Mexico in 84, the revolutionary events of 68, etc., etc. We can go back in time and we can see that Occupy is part of that, but it's not the end. It's maybe just the beginning or an element in the middle. So that is one thing. People were there, they learned new relations. The other thing is, I think it's a very useful concept. When we talk about politics within emancipatory framework today, we talk about prefigurative politics. Now, earlier I mentioned this problem of deferral. It's temporal deferral. You defer your emancipation to the future. Okay. Prefigurative politics works against that. Why? Because you act in the form of the individual or society you want to be. You act that way in the here and now. And in this way, you also, you not only defer, you're working against this deferral to the future, but you're also replacing the burden of responsibility. So it's no longer some elite, some 1% that you or I will never meet in our lives, but it's our own relations, the way we act, that have the possibility of changing society. Slowly, but nonetheless, surely. So I'm not sure about, yes. This, yeah.
Audience? Probably it was too much already, so maybe if you want to comment on this, or I have another topic, maybe we've spoken about depression, the necessity of cocaine for saving capitalism, pros and economy. We've spoken about the net. What I want to ask you is, what about the very real and physical repression? Repression in its very physical form that also seems to become an important method of, let's say, status quo, also in the so-called democracy. And I would say that my case, like also the Occupy movement, benign as it was, I agree, it was an authentic expression of the contemporary social conditions. It's not difficult to agree on this, but it was recognized as a serious threat and met with fierce repression. Let's say in the United States of America, Occupy faced a coordinated, a physical attack of, I don't know, many different police forces that was coordinated at a very high level. So also we have new laws banning protests, criminalizing protests in Spain, in Greece, in Turkey. We see criminalization of practices that maybe 20, 30 years ago were perceived as normal political practices. So my question is this, does this indicate a paradigmatic shift that's also significant, that we need to confront? Because also it's not just physical violence on the streets from Istanbul to New York, Madrid, Barcelona. It's also like the system of surveillance, like Nikolai was mentioned before, the revelations from last couple of years.
I think to this list you should definitely add extraterritorial forms of law, Guantanamo Bay, or extrajudicial killings. The drones are like angels of death, aren't they? And they kill a whole village. And these are the signs of the arbitrary nature of the violence of the future. Because we can all be affected. So you should definitely add those things to your list too.
So actually the problem of repression should be redefined, because there is something I was in Istanbul 3 weeks ago, just before May 1st, and the Gezi Park Occupy movement, I was there with friends, and they told me about the reaction of the Turkish state, of Erdogan on one side, but also they told me about the instrumentalization, I can say, of the movement by Gulen, this anti-Erdogan, who is a representative of a sort of alliance between secret services, military, and Islamic forces. So in Turkey, you have as a consequence of the Gezi Party, not as a consequence, after post-hoc, not propter-hoc, as an effect, no, as a consequence, no, as thereafter the movement, you have the polarization of two fascist forces. But the same is happening in Egypt. The same is happening in Spain in a different way. You have the movement, then the rise of the Catalan independentism, which is very well mannered, democratic, and friendly, if you want, and peaceful, maybe, but I would not say the same of the Madrileño Partido Popolare, which is the direct descendant of the Falange of Francisco Franco. So what happens is that the inability of the movement of power to produce a political effect of consolidation of a social front of resistance is the the deployment of a double form of repression. So the movement becomes a sort of excuse, of possibility of regulating a conflict inside the power. So I don't want to say that I don't like. I say the Occupy is over. Forgive me. It's never a good thing to claim the end of the movement when you don't have an alternative. But my problem is this. The specificity, the novelty of the movement of Occupy, like you, in the history, a 50 years long history of movement, of self-organization, society, and so on and so on. The novelty of Occupy has been, in my opinion, the recollection, the reconjunction, the reactivation of the erotic social body in the physical space. The coming back of the body, in a sense. But be aware that the coming back of the body is a difficult game because the body that comes back is also the fascist body of power.
Yeah.
We are calling, in a sense, we are calling back the most horrible form of...
We show our unity here today in the square. Yeah.
That is the problem. This is why I say, just wait a minute. We have to better understand what is our possibility of expression. We have come out, and it was necessary, as a force of physical occupation of the city. Now we have to be able to transfer this energy. This energy has to be precious. We should be able to recollect, to call again the force of occupation as an engine, as the states are not in the physical space of the square. The real state, the real problem is in a totally disembodied place, which is the virtual form of power. How can we be able, how will we be able to transfer the erotic energy that comes from the physical space of the square into a cognitive ability to deconstruct the power of financial capitalism? That is the problem. And I don't have the answer to this question. say that the displacement, the investment of this energy has to go towards the form of our expectations. The main problem in the relation between society and power is expectations. The future is there. I mean, the capitalist modelation of future, the induction, the inoculation of economic, consumerist expectations, competitive expectations in the body mind of the movement. So the strategy, the next step has to be, don't forget about the square. The square is an important place to meet again and to feel the energy of the social body, but also don't mistake the place as the square as the real place of the change, of the transformation, because the real place is where is in a sense inside the connection of our minds.
But isn't that already happening in a way? I mean, after the future, you have a brilliant sociological croquis, a brilliant sociological sketch. Franco writes, he looks at a group of precarious workers commuting towards work, and he says, these people, what are they doing? They're listening to their mobile devices, they're texting, they're sharing the same metro, the same tube, but they're connected with the world, but they're not communicating with each other. They're completely unable to form any kind of social fabric amongst themselves. And I just asked myself, well, isn't precisely, or to say the same thing that you just said, it didn't produce that social fabric, that people met each other. I know this sounds terribly naive, but that they met each other, they formed new forms of contact, and it wasn't that space that produces new possibilities, but the fact that they go home, do their own projects, engage with other people that they otherwise hadn't met. I mean, look, I'll give you a specific example. I met Andrej in Prague in 2000, just after the demonstrations against the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Andrej had just come out of prison for slightly misbehaving during a demonstration. He viciously attacked the policeman's fist with his nose and various other things. Police officers' leg with his stomach, etc., etc. And my life has never been the same since. We met, I mean, that was a chance meeting, and out of that friendship, a lot of other social fabric has been with them. Last but not least, we wouldn't be here today discussing these things. And a lot, I know, as I said, I know this sounds terribly naive, but a lot can happen out of this. And I'll end again on a very naive note. Franco and I just, before we came into this roundtable discussion, we shared a sandwich together. And to me,
Yours.
okay, well, properties. But I'm giving the sandwiches an example. These are small acts, they're very, very small. But they can lead to something, and that is the important thing. And I think Occupy didn't end with Occupy, it ended when it began, when everybody went to, with these new connections, contacts, etc.
The idea is the idea used to be to storm heaven, and now we speak about sharing a sandwich. Is this a problem for us? Or should it be?
Well, I don't think the world has enough resources for everybody to eat cake, so sandwiches sound like a pretty good bet. And as Franco writes, I think our future modes of emancipation will probably have to, precisely because of the finity of the resources we have, will have to be based on frugality, but also enjoyment.
changing expectation is that the ability to make richness, the redefining the concept and non-concept, the perception of richness. What does it mean to be rich? Having many things in the frigidaire, being rich means having time, and being frugal. Frugal is not poor. Frugal is happy. Someone who is happy. I'm not preaching the sacrifice. But no, the contrary. And the richness, the definition of richness, is very much to do with expectations. The change of social expectation that has been produced by massive advertising in the last 30, 40 years has been one of the main forces of power.
The last opportunity for any comments, interventions. Anyone? Okay, so then this will be my final question for you, Franco. At the end of the book, you make quite a, I would say, daring statement, saying that we are experiencing, that what we are experiencing in the last couple of years, like the crisis, economic depression, and all that is not just one of the capitalist crises that will soon pass. And the new cycle of accumulation will begin. But that this is the final collapse of the system. I find this quite daring, as I said, and also maybe at some other point in the book you also remind ourselves of Millennium Bug, which was another moment when you were predicting an apocalyptic crash. So,
actually, you know, at the end of 99, I've been repeating everywhere that the Millennium Bug was coming to change everything, and it was the apocalypse. And I said that to my friends, to my colleagues. I also said that in a TV program which was dedicated to cyber culture and so on. So I was scaring people, and I like to do that. Then at the night at the end of the millennium, I was in front of my TV screen, waiting for something, but not so much, and nothing happened, of course. But the apocalypse that we were feeling at the end of the century was there. Think to the dot-com crash of April 2000, which has really changed the social perception of the internet, of precarious labor. In the 90s, quality workers were rich. In 2001, quality workers were precarious and poor. Then came September 11, 2001. You see that the apocalypse was true. So I think that a relevant part of the general intellect is the general intuition that can also be called the perception of imminence. You see, when you try to feel the zeitgeist, what is the zeitgeist? Germans probably mean something different, but for me, zeitgeist means the perception of imminence. By this point of view, I say, yes, actually, the financial collapse 2008 has been the end of modern capitalism and a real systemic collapse. I am not even sure that it was a crisis in the sense of the economic crisis, changing something in economic dynamics and so on and so on. What I see is that it has been a change in the social perception of the future, of look at Europe, and for 500 years we Europeans have been thinking that we are rich. We were exploiting the planet, we were enslaving black people and Asian people and so on and so on. We were the master of the planet. All of a sudden, we have been overnight, we have been advised that we are poor and we have to think about the future in terms of poverty. Is it an honest distribution of wealth in the planet? So Europeans become a little bit poor, but the good Chinese are becoming very rich and happy, and the Mexicans and black people and Africans and so on are better. No, the contrary is true. Europeans have become poor and unhappy because they are the bad example. Because Chinese workers could say, oh, an Italian worker is cashing 2,000 euros in a month. So that's a very bad example. So an Italian worker has to become poor, take 600 euros for his work. So the Chinese worker will understand that exploitation is the only way, and misery is the only possible future that you can wait for. By this point of view, the financial collapse has really changed everything. Well, the problem now is that the game has become very dangerous, because if we are unable to find a way out, the picture is already here. It's the dissolution of the Antarctica ice, just to name a possibility. It's literally the end of the social civilization.
Okay, it seems that we've reached the end, unless there is some urgent intervention. I thought so. Thank you to everybody that came today here, and those that attended all the other events during the visit to Franco in Bulgaria. Thank you, Nikolai, for your contributions, and again, thank you, Franco, and of course all the organizers. I think we can now